Welcome to Campaign Terrain. I'm your host Cross, and today I'm going to lead you down the garden path, or the forested path, or the path through the jungle, or the path across that field. But basically we're working on paths. They're configurable, you can arrange them how you'd like, and they will get you where you need to go here on Campaign Terrain. Let's jump right in. I'm going to cover the materials you're going to need. I'm going to show you some that I did not use and should have because mistakes were made. Cover that really quick, and we'll make this as quick as possible. Then we'll get into the tools you need, and then we'll get into the build. This is what you're going to try to end up with. You've got a path with some grass on it. You can put it where you need to go. You can put multiples together and line them up and have a path leading to where you need. This only has 2 layers, and it's really simple to do. Now, originally, I based this entire thing on styrene to-go boxes. This is really flimsy stuff, and I ended up not using that. Let me show you one bad example. Here's one that had that, and you see how flexible it is. This is not really what you're going to want to end up with. So I moved from that to this cardboard, what's called light card. This is the same thing you get on the back of certain notepads, things like that. This one happens to be food packaging. The one that I actually used was from Notepad. This thin card is what I used. I do not recommend this. So it also comes out too flimsy at the end. You can't really see it, but it's a little bit too flexible. What I do recommend is the thin corrugated. Now this is the one my blender came in. It's pretty sturdy stuff. You can take this, and if you really wanted to make it sturdy, you could take 2 layers of it and cross hatch the pattern in the cardboard, and it would make it almost impossible to bend accidentally on your table. So I recommend the thin corrugated, but it is not what I used. Now, the stones are made out of the styrene. And this particular one, I used the ones from this piece of black here. And you can see it's pretty flexible stuff too, but since it's only going to be basically the size of your thumbprint and each one's glued to a base, that's not going to adversely affect it. So all we're using for this is card, styrene, and then the texturings. Now, let's start with the basics. Attaching the stones to the backing, I used hot glue. I always use mine on low temp. It does not particularly matter, but on high temp you can melt the styrene. So just be wary of that. If you've got a dual temp, I would leave it on low temp. To build up on the side of the stones where the dirt, we're going to end up with this, which is the dirt fill in. So you've got your stone and your dirt, but you want a texture on that, and what I've used for that is spackle. Now this is your basic household spackle. On the other side of the pond they call it filler, so this is just filler or spackle. It is a basic white paste. You can work it with your fingers. It's got a tiny bit of grit to it you can feel, but it comes out really smooth. It sets up and dries within 10 minutes to an hour depending on your humidity, and it is not expensive. This particular package was $1, and I got it at the Dollar Tree store here in the United States. So it's going to be $1.25 in Canada. I don't know if it's available on the other side of the pond. The next thing we're going to have is the flocking. So you can use any color flock you want. If you have an alien planet, you can have it pink, purple, yellow. If you want it to be all one shade of green, you can do that. If you want it to be all one shade of yellow, like dead grass for the winter, you can do that. You could mix and match them, or you can use all one color. I happen to have this one, which is my catch-all. Every time I use green, I dump it into this box. So this probably has 6 or 7 different colors of green in it, and that's what I used. I just sprinkled it on. Now, in order to get it to stick, I use a regular PVA glue. This one is an Elmer's bottle, and Elmer's works really well. It can be the glue. It can be the glue all, which is a little bit sturdier than the school glue. It can be the school glue. It can be anything. I refill my bottles from a huge jug all the time, so I actually have no idea which PVA is in here, but Elmer's is a good one. Let's talk paints. To get that white spackle to have this dirt color, I used a raw sienna, basically straight out of the bottle. To get this lighter color, I used a brown. This one happens to be Martha Stewart's tree trunk brown. Doesn't have to be any brown that'll work for you. And to be honest, there's very little of the brown in there. Most of this is actually white. This one happens to be Misty White by Apple Barrel. And all you need is something to delineate the color of your pavers from your soil, just so you can see where the path is at. Those can be any color you want, but I happen to use a light brown on this, a tan. Alright, so that's it for materials. Let's make the jump, and I'll show you the equipment you need. Equipment time. Let's talk about what you're going to need to build this. We already talked about the hot gun. You're going to want to set that to low temp. You can set it to high temp if you want, but it may end up melting the styrene. So low temp glue gun if you got one, or set it to low if you've got a dual temp. It can be any type of glue. The glue comes in different styles and thicknesses. Whichever one works for you is going to work for this. So I'm going to set that to the side because that's already heated up. All right, now to cut your card out, both to cut it to size and to round off the corners, we're going to need something to cut that with. I typically cut that on the mat and use one of these utility knives. You could also use a hobby knife, but you could also use the scissors if you wanted. And either way, just anything to cut these to the size. Now I make all mine a uniform size so they fit together. We'll cover that in just a minute during the building, but you're going to want a knife for that probably. Now for the styrene pieces on the top that will become stepping stones, those are going to be in a big sheet. You're probably going to want to take your knife and cut them into strips and then into little squares. Then you can take the squares and cut them down with a pair of scissors. I find these bigger ones actually are more comfortable in my hand. I do have a smaller pair and these work really well, but they have these metal handles and they sort of hurt after a while. So I tend to use the slightly larger pair. You want a pair that you're not worried about getting dull, because you're going through a lot of styrene and styrene dulls blades. There are ways to sharpen scissors, but just as a warning, don't use the good scissors for that. You're going to take those strips of styrene and you're going to end up with dozens of these little circles. So you want to find a pair of scissors that's really going to be comfy for you. Okay, once you've got everything on the board and you're ready to work on it, you're going to want to paint that. So you're going to need something like a palette. I just use a piece of cardboard and just something to mix your colors on and to paint from. You're going to need some paintbrushes. This has a slightly rocky texture. I tend to do a lot of stippling and a lot of ramming the paint into corners, so you're going to want something that you're not worried about hurting. This is my raggedy old brush I use for almost everything. One of these days I'm going to have to replace this. It's actually really my best brush, even though it looks like it's in bad shape. This has a similar issue going on as well, and you are going to want a tiny one for things like when you're painting between the individual stones. Once it's done and you're doing something such as touching up the stones with a dry brush, or to put a second layer on, you want to stipple. I find these makeup brushes tend to work really well, but you can use whatever you need to. But you're going to want a different type of brush, just so you can dry brush or over brush. When you're using paint, you're always going to want to clean up. So I have the jar of the paint water. This is my little marker here. It says don't drink the paint water. You don't want to do that. And I've got a towel. I use these rags for everything. This is just a part of an old t-shirt. So wet rag, palette, jar of water, paintbrushes, scissors, knives, and that pretty much covers it for the equipment. All right, let's get into this build. Let's start with cutting it out. How do you decide on the pattern? You just choose. Whatever you think is going to work together for you for your sizing is going to work for you. Sometimes I work off of a specific plan. Sometimes I work off of how big the piece of cardboard is. Now the ones I actually use for the project, the piece that I cut just happened to be twice this wide and 3 of these long, so I cut these out. This is basically 1/6 of the sheet I had, and it happens to come out to 3 inches by 4 1/4. I don't know if you can see that here on this, but it's about 3 inches by 4 1/4. That's just what I decided looked good, and so that the pieces would work together at the end if I wanted to line them up in different ways. We are going to be rounding those corners, so you want to keep that in mind. So for this one, it happens to be just a little over 2 3/4 thick. I've got 2 of these that are the same size. These are off a piece of food packaging, so they're just a little over 2 3/4, and they're just a little over 5 inches long. I'm going to try to make them match close to the size of my other ones, so I'm going to cut them to 4 1/4 as well. Basic knife, keep your hands out of the way. Now I've got these lines on here. If you follow these dots, I'm going to cut this at 4 1/4. Let me move more to the center there. I'm going to start with this line here, so that's 3 4 1/4 right here. Now you can use a straight edge, but you really don't need to be that specific and picky with it. It is probably going to take a couple more passes, especially if you're cutting both layers at once like I'm doing here. Okay, now that we've got our basic shape, I'm going to just pick an arbitrary size. On this, I'm going to go with 2 inches wide in the middle is where I'm going to start my curve, and 1 inch out is where I'm going to start my curve. So I'm going to start from that 1 inch and curve to the 2 inch mark. That's that little corner off. Now, I'm going to use that corner to cut all of the pieces off the other one. That way I only ever have to measure it or look at it too hard once. So you can see how that's going to go. I'm going to flip it over and get different sides, get all the different corners off these. I'm going to come back in just a second and we'll start from the piece that's already cut, and I'll show you about attaching the papers. Right, so let's cut some papers. As I said, my others are made out of styrene. This is a little thinner than that black stuff I use, but the black stuff doesn't really show up on screen very well. So as you can see, that's just a pile of black. But basically, that's what we're coming out looking for, is just different sizes of little papers. They can be slightly larger than each other, slightly smaller than each other. And these little pieces on the edge aren't really going to matter. You can pluck them off as you glue them on. And I do have some smaller ones if I want to try to fit into corners and things like that. But all I did was cut them into squares. I used a knife for that. Got me a bunch of strips. Decided roughly where I wanted them to be. I just literally cut hundreds of these squares off. Then, took a pair of scissors. You can speed this up a little by stacking ones that are of a similar size. Now this one's larger. You're not going to want to cut that with those unless you want to cut it down to size. But you can take several layers of this and cut them all at once. And all you do is that. And you end up with the rounded corners. Do that on all 4 corners. And that's basically your stone done. It's that quick and simple. Now, this whole bowl here took 2 hours. I was watching a show on TV, and I just kept cutting and cutting and cutting there on a TV tray, and ended up with all of this plus what you're going to see in the actual build. So it doesn't really take that much time, and you do not want them uniform. You want everyone to be slightly different so they have a natural look to them. Let's jump into gluing them down. All right, this is really simple, though this is the part that I tend to overthink. You don't really need a pattern other than you want a path down the middle. So all you have to do is essentially pick the middle line and put pavers on either side of it or down the way. All you have to do, take your glue gun. I do not suggest putting it onto the paver. I suggest putting it onto the base. If you put it on the paver, you're just going to end up with glue strings all over your hands. So put down a dollop of glue. It does not have to be nearly that much. Kind of overdid that. And put that on there. While it's still a little bit gooey, you want to slide it over. You do want some space between there so that it looks like there's earth between your pavers. So make sure that your pavers all have a slight gap in them, 32nd to a 16th of an inch. That's about a half a millimeter to a millimeter. All right, then you just take glue gun. You want to put the glue on. You want to wipe it so you end up with, well, you don't keep getting those little stringers. And then follow the whole thing down, and eventually you'll have a whole bunch of them done that look just like this. All right, let's get to the spackling and texturing this. Let's get to texturing the stones first, then we'll get to the spackling. I'll be right back. All right, I'd like to apologize. When I went through the equipment section, I did forget to tell you you're going to need something to texture them with. So you need something like an aluminum ball, a rock, anything that you want that's going to put a sort of realistic stony texture into the foam. Now, here's what they look like after they've been textured. You can see all these little dimples and pock marks, and here it is when they're still smooth and look like the original packaging. There is some texture to them just based on the different pieces of styrene, but these have not been textured yet, and these have. Let me show you how easy this is. Take a ball of aluminum. If you've watched any of these crafting channels, you know how this goes. You just take the aluminum and roll it how you want. Don't keep rolling them in the same direction. Don't keep rolling them in diagonals. You end up with patterns. That one has texture, and these don't. And to finish out the whole board, takes, what was that, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, and is now textured. So that's it. We'll take one of these textured boards and I'll show you about spackling in just a second. Ready to jump on into this. Now, as I said, this is just a simple paste. There's nothing to it. It's a little strange. It's almost like those orange circus peanut candies is what it feels like. It's got that sort of texture to it, except squishy. And all you do is take it and stick it where you want and start to smear it in so that it gets in between the stones. Don't care if you get a little bit on top. We're going to wipe that off in just a minute. You want to fill all of this in as if this is the grout between stones, between wall stones, or as if the dirt has gotten in between all of these ground pavers. Once the grooves are done, you can come along the side and you want to smooth that along there as well. Now, you want a little bit of texture over there. So you can take your finger and sort of tap this and it will pull up a texture on that. However, if you do that immediately, it's going to try to come up on your finger. It's going to let go of the substrate platform it's built on. So what I suggest doing is smear all of this into all the nooks and crannies and then wait about 10 minutes and then come back and tap it with the texture. But don't let it dry all the way, otherwise you're going to have to retexture it with something else like sand or something. I told you I was going to tell you how to take the white off the top of the stones. So if you've got this white stuff on top and you can't just wipe it off with your finger, all you have to do is take your damp rag that I suggested in the equipment, dip it into your water, just get a little on your fingertip, and gently wipe it in a circle. If you end up with one of these little droplets of the white stuff, you can just dab it off like that with a drier piece of the cloth. See, this one's really bad here. It's covered up with, take your cloth, and while the spackle is still wet, still damp, just take that and wipe to the edges of your stone, and it'll clear that off so that you can paint it more easily. Alright, I'll be right back to show you how the painting goes. Here's where we're starting out, and here's where we want to end up. I'm going to show you the first step, which is doing the dirt. Then I'm going to let that dry. Then I'll come back. For you, it'll just be a couple seconds. For me, it'll probably be an hour. And then I'll come back and paint the stones. But the stones are the easy part. So we'll go with the hard part first. Set that off to the side. You're going to take your paint. You can put this on a separate piece if you want or whatever. I just work on these round pieces of cardboard as a palette and workspace and all of that, just to keep it from getting onto my cutting board here. I'm going to put you a little dollop on there. Now you're going to want to have more paint out than that if you're doing like 10 or 12 of these at a time, but we start there. Now I do not specifically start with a wet brush or a dry brush. It doesn't really matter. I'll probably end up wetting this during the time of actually painting, but for right now I'm starting out with dry bristles on this. Just want to take a little, get a decent amount in there so that it spreads so you don't have to keep refilling. And that's it. We're just going to cover this. You want to get really good coverage. You want 100% coverage if you can get it down into all the nooks and crannies. You don't want any of the white spackle coming through. Now, like I said, if you find a way to get a colored spackle or to color the spackle you have, by all means use that filler instead. For me, I'm having to use this white, so I want to make sure to not miss any spots. So you're going to want to taper that off a little, not have a big glob on there when you're going between them. I find the easiest way is to start right between them and pull out, and that way you'll get coverage between without actually hitting the stones. Don't try to start here and go all the way through. So for the other side, of course, I want to come around here and then pull the other direction. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to finish painting this one, and then once it's dry, I'll come back and show you how to paint the stones. This is now dried. Got some paint here. I've got probably way more than I need, but I'm doing 6 of these. So I'm going to take the white and mix it with the brown to get a nice light color that's going to show up well against the green. So you want to take that, and you basically want this to be an overbrush, not really a dry brush. Now, if you started off with these being white, you're going to need a base coat or something like that, or you're going to need a darker brown, something to come to the same sort of shade. But it's still basically the same thing. It's a simple paint job. You just need these to be tan and not uniformly flat. You just want sort of a coloration to them. So I'm going to take my paint here and essentially stipple it onto my stones. Make sure to get to the very edges. You want it to look like a stone, not like it blends into the grass. And that's it, one down. There's 10 on this one. I'm going to go ahead and get this and my other one's painted, and then I'll come back to show you about flocking. Flocking is going to work basically like the painting of the dirt did. You're going to paint around all of your stones, but this time you're going to use glue to do it, not a paint. Grab a blob of glue, your paintbrush. You're going to want this kind of thick. You do want the flocking to stick. Same thing, you want to get between all the stones but not up on top of them, but you definitely want to cover all of the dirt. You're going for at least a 95% coverage here. It's okay if some of the dirt shows through. Essentially you want to cover the entire ground with the glue. I'm going to finish painting this one up. I'll be right back to drop the flocking on it. I've got that pretty liberally coated in glue all over the place except on the stones. I definitely don't want any stones for this. Alright, now we're going to take our flock. As I said, mine's a mixed colors of green, but you can use whatever color you want. And you want to make sure to get it on all of the glue. You don't want to stick it straight on and pat it down, but you want to sort of, I don't know if you see, but I'm starting about a foot up from that, sort of like that, and just sprinkling it on. It's just like putting salt or pepper on your food. You just take it and sprinkle it from on high. Make sure to hit all the spots with the glue. Once it's on there, if you've missed any spots, then you can come by and tap it into the spots a little, but you definitely want it on there first before you go doing that. Pretty good coverage, and let that dry. It's going to soak up a lot of the glue and stay where it needs to be. Once it's done and dry, then you can brush it off of the pavers. Give me a few minutes and, well, a few seconds for you, and let this harden up for about an hour, and I'll come back and I'll brush all that off, and we'll see what's going on with that. I even touched up a couple of spots, oops, there you go, on the one that I'd already done. I'd already finished that other sample off, so I did that one as well. But here's the one that you saw me put the glue on earlier. And it's just a matter of tipping it over, knocking it off, and you can sort of thump it if you want to. So that's it. They're done and done. You've got the stones in their color as I showed you with the stippling. You've got the dirt under there. You can still see it. It looks straight through the grass. You got the grass line with heavy coverage so there's not just dirt patches everywhere. And as you can see, if you want to arrange it in a path, if you want a straight line, you've got that option. And I made them with these little curves on them so that you can set them if you want to make a curved path through the woods or whichever. But that's it, basic flagstone path. You can, if you stick around to the end, and I'm going to show you this set out on my big board that I made in one of my other videos. If you don't stick around, just remember to check us out on social media, and please like, share, and subscribe. Otherwise, we'll see you in just a minute, and I'll show you this as an example on my big board. Our intrepid adventurers approach the cave on their map. Where they expect nothing but overgrown jungle, they find a carefully cleared path. They know they should be cautious. They're not alone. Some enemies are closer or more dangerous than they expect. We'll see you next time. Thanks for coming to Campaign Terrain.